I'm telling you, Jesus is God. And there is never a time when he isn't God. And we don't want to ever leave you with the impression that Jesus is not God. Because if you ever have that impression, then folks, hey, the whole business of the cross is down the tubes. Because what difference does it make in the death of another nice guy? Lots of nice guys die, but they didn't save me. This is what God is pulling off. Jesus is God, the second member of the Trinity. As God, you know that he has omni-qualities. He has things as God. They're his possession. They're his attributes. He operates out of them. Jesus is God. He has these attributes. For instance, God is omnipresent. Jesus is omnipresent. He has omnipresent ability. That is, everywhere at one time. He's God. He has that. Jesus is God. He has omnipotence, all-powerfulness. He is all-powerful. God is all-powerful. Jesus is God. He's all-powerful. That's one of his omni-qualities. Jesus is God. He has omniscience. He knows everything. He knows your future. He sees everything as now. Jesus is all-knowing. There isn't anything he doesn't know because he's God, and God has these qualities. And since Jesus is God, he has all of these qualities. But wait a minute. Jesus, who's God, has leaped off his throne and become man. He's assumed the body and nature of man. And in one person, there's the total nature of God and the total nature of man in an indissoluble union. So is Jesus as a man omnipresent? He has these attributes. He's God. Now he's become man. As a man, what happens to all the things that he has as God? Again, the scriptures is very clear on that. Ephesians chapter 2, it says he emptied himself. Now, he didn't empty himself of being God. He emptied himself of everything he had as God. That makes sense, doesn't it? That you can give up what you have without giving up who you are. He never gave up being who he is. He's God. But God set aside everything he had in order to ever enter into the flesh. It's beautiful. So Jesus, who is God, with all of these attributes and all of these abilities, has leaped off his throne and given up what he has as God. Didn't give up being God, gave up what he has as God and became a man. For instance, let's deal with omnipresence. Jesus is God. He's omnipresent. Have no problem with that. He's leaped off his throne and become man. As a man was Jesus everywhere at one time. For instance, when he's on his way to Jerusalem, from Jericho to Jerusalem, which was a 15-mile trip, could he turn to his disciples and say, I'm already there? Or did he have to walk like everybody else? Well, you're going to say he had to walk like everybody else. Well, if he's omnipresent, he could be here, there. He could preach 50 Sermon on the Mounts at the same time. But he didn't do that. So what happened to his omnipresence? He took his omnipresence and said, I'm going to limit myself to be in one spot like you are. I'm going to limit myself to the space that you occupy. And I'm setting aside it's mine. I'm God. I have a right to it. It wasn't taken away from him. He yielded up. He will say he has a safety deposit box underneath his throne up in the sky, and he took it and put it in the safety deposit box. It's his. He still has it. It's his, but he just says, I'm not using it. I'm going to limit myself because you don't have omnipresence. I'm not going to have omnipresence either, Jesus said. And he limited himself to be in one spot at one time like you are. For instance, Jesus is God. As God, he has omniscience, all-knowing. He knows everything. Now, he's leaped off his throne and become a baby. As a baby, did he know everything? For instance, did the shepherds come up and go, coochie, coochie, coo? And Jesus looked at him and in Greek said, what are you doing that for? He had to learn the language, didn't he? Well, then he didn't know everything, obviously. In fact, the scriptures in Luke chapter 2, verse 52 says that he grew in wisdom. How do you grow in wisdom if you know everything? In fact, Hebrews, the writer of the Hebrews says, though he was a son, yet learned he obedience. Do you realize that Jesus, the disciples turned to Jesus in the Gospel of Mark and said, when you're coming back the second time? And Jesus said, don't know. Well, Jesus was really smart. No question there. He seemed to know some things that other folks didn't know. No question there. But that's not omniscience. All you have to do is find one thing he didn't know to say he doesn't know everything. So what did he do with his omniscience? Oh, could I suggest to you that he put it in that safety deposit box? It's his. He has a right to it. But he said, I'm limiting myself to one spot like you are, and I'm limiting myself to the knowledge that you have available to you. And I'm going to have no resource of knowledge that you don't have. Wow. Jesus is God. Absolutely. As God, he's omnipotent, all-powerful. Okay. So sin isn't any problem to him. He just steps on the head of the devil. I mean, there's no problem. Okay. So Jesus is God and he's all-powerful. But wait a minute. He's leaped off his throne and become a man. As a man was he all-powerful. Now, wait a minute, preacher. If you're going to say that Jesus as a man walking on this earth wasn't all-powerful, how'd he do the miracles he did? Oh. Don't you realize, sure you do, don't you realize that Jesus didn't do any miracles for 30 years? Did absolutely nothing. I think he coached a little league team, but outside of that, he didn't do anything. The man did absolutely nothing. Didn't teach in the synagogue, didn't teach a Sunday school class, we have no record that he did anything. Mashed his thumb at the carpenter shop, that was the best he could pull off. Then all of a sudden, you got all of these miracles, all this ministry, you got all this stuff happening. Whoa, it's an avalanche. It's like somebody flipped his switch. It's like something happened to him that just, whoa, it just gushed out of him. And ministry took place, and he had 3 years of it. It was just phenomenal. And you look at him and said, whoa, what happened to him? What set him off? And you know, don't you? He went down to John at the River Jordan and said, you're going to baptize me. He said, no, I'm not. He said, yes, you are. And they came down into that water, and when they came up out of that water, the Father, through the Spirit, filled the man called Jesus. And Jesus didn't do what he did because he's God, although he is God. Don't get confused. He didn't do what he did because he's God, although he is God. But the reason he did what he did was he was a man filled with God. Because he limited himself to be in one spot like you are. He limited himself to the knowledge you have available to you. And he limited himself to the resource, the sourcing, the power that you have available to you. That's phenomenal. In fact, it's better than phenomenal. If you would back me into a corner and say, do you like this concept? Do you like this to be that way? Is that what you really like? I would say, absolutely not. I would change this if I could. See, what I would choose is, I would choose Jesus to be God, come down here, his feet never get dirty, he walks about 7 feet above the ground, 7 inches above the ground, and his feet, he didn't have to wear deodorant, he didn't like the girls, and he didn't have to sleep. And when they put a nail in his hand, it didn't hurt, and he had no problem with sin at all, because he's God, and he's just walking around zapping people, and wow, isn't that great? Then when you come to me and say, you should be like Jesus, I'd laugh at you and say, what? I can't be like Jesus. You know why? He's God. If I were God, I could be like Jesus, but I'm not God. But what if the way Jesus lived wasn't because he's God? What if the way Jesus lived is because he was a man filled with God, and that what filled Jesus, the Spirit of God, can also fill you, so what made Jesus, Jesus can remake that in you. Whoa. That would change things, wouldn't it? In fact, the irritating thing about all of that is that would eliminate all my excuses. Because up to this time I've said, hey, I'm not God. I'm just a man. Oh, I'm only a human being. Well, so was he. See, up to this time I said, well, listen, I came from an abusive background. So you can't expect much out of me. But you see, he came from an abusive background. In fact, when he was a grown man and ministering, they kept looking at him saying, at least we know who our Father is and you don't. See, I've been able to say up to this time, well, I'm homeless. On the streets. Jesus was homeless. Foxes have holes. Birds of the air have nests. Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Well, people hate me. They just hate me. I think you'll find that in the scriptures as well, that some folks didn't like him too well. So what this does is, this literally eliminates every excuse that I've got. See, why can't I live like I ought to live? Well, why can't I be what I ought to be? Well, why can't I have the attitude I ought to have? Well, why can't I? If this isn't about me, if this is about being filled with the Spirit that caused Jesus to be Jesus, maybe if I could be filled with that same Spirit, if Jesus could come and live in me like the Father lived in him, whoa, wouldn't that be phenomenal? Incarnation, assuming flesh. Second member of the Trinity, who's God, leaped off his throne, assumed the body and nature of man. And in one person, there's the total nature of God and the total nature of man in this indissoluble union. Jesus, who's God, never gave up being God. He gave up everything he had as God and limited himself to be in one spot like you are, to the knowledge you have available to you, to the resource of living that you have available to you. And everything that made him different than you, he set it aside and said, I'm not using that. And came down on your level to say, guys, here's how it's done. Here's how it's done. Would you let me work in your life like I let the Father work in my life? Would you let me flow through you like the Father flowed through me? Would you give your life to me like I gave my life to the Father? Come on. Now, folks, don't look the way you look, because this is not a finger in your face, a bawling out. This is a, whoa, do you know what we got a hold of here? Do you know what the possibilities are for you? Woo! You can be the person you ought to be. You can live like you ought to live. You can be victorious. Oh, listen, you can conquer. You can. This is good news. Jesus, thank you for Christmas. Oh, thank you for Christmas. Oh. God, you just constantly push the limits. You didn't come, leap off your throne and jump into a palace with silk sheets. You came and was born in a stable with the smell of manure and cows hanging around. You just pushed the limits. You didn't become one of the Pharisees and Sadducees and aristocrats of your day. You became a peasant boy in Nazareth, which was the slums of Israel, the worst town in all of Israel and of all of Galilee. Wow. You had everything against you. And yet in the fullness of the Spirit, you lived in victory. God, grip us tonight. Ring in our ears that you have gone to this extent. I mean, think of it. God giving up all that He has in order to join me and change my life. What kind of response should I make to that, Jesus? Should I fall on my face? Should I cry out to you? Should I yield myself to you and before you? And here's the deal, Jesus. Everything in my life tonight, everything in my life that blockades the flow of the Spirit of Jesus in me, I want you to remove it. I want you to cleanse it. I want you to transform me. I want every thought, everything that's going on in my life that's anti-blockades, hinders you in any way from you manifesting yourself through me like the Father manifested Himself through you. I'd like to be the life of Jesus for my home, church, community. Here I am. Heads are bowed. Altars open. Seeking. Why wouldn't you want this? Why wouldn't you surrender like this? Why wouldn't you lay at His feet? Why wouldn't you give yourself? Why wouldn't I be His? Why wouldn't I cry out? Why wouldn't I turn Him loose in my life to do what I've never been able to get done? Why wouldn't I set aside my trying and struggling and attempting and doing? Why wouldn't I die to my pride and all the silliness and stupidity of my own little efforts, which never have achieved anything but chaos and disaster in my life? Why wouldn't I be filled with Him and let Him produce Jesus in me? Oh, Jesus, give me yourself in unprecedented ways, in fullness, uncomprehendable, flowing. I'm not asking to understand it all tonight. I'm asking to experience it all tonight. Fill me, Jesus, fill me. Cleanse me. Be born in me. As you had your own flesh 2,000 years ago, oh, would you take on mine tonight? Let me be born from above in a new way. As you had your own body 2,000 years ago, would you take on my body tonight? Could I be the body of Christ? Could you give me your mind? Could I be possessed with you? Be obedient. Want to seek with me?